Good afternoon and welcome everybody. I'll do my teacher pause and let everybody just settle for a moment. Welcome to our first plenary panel session this afternoon. My name is Karina Menzies-Ballantyne and I'm from CQ University, Australia. As is our tradition in Australia, I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet today and the lands from which you all come. I pay my respects to the elders and the ancestors, for they hold the wisdom, the knowledge, and they share that knowledge with us through generations, for which we are most grateful. Hopefully we're going to share you some wisdom and knowledge here today as well with our two wonderful speakers. But we do want this to be a conversation, so you will notice that some blank pieces of paper have been put on the table in front of you. If during the presentations there are questions or ideas that arise, please do write them down, and the wonderful staff here at APSEU are going to collect those, collate them and bring them up so we can pose some questions depending how much time allows at the presentation end. Our panel session this afternoon is the multidimensionality of GCED in the face of multiple crises, such as increasing violence and climate crises. We've had some very, very concrete examples internationally of this and locally over the last few months. I was travelling in Europe when we had the terrible fires that raged across Europe and many parts of the Northern Hemisphere. In my own country, we have just seen the defeat of a referendum that would have acknowledged our first people and given them a voice to Parliament, for which I hold my head in shame. And just this morning, we woke to the news of the terrible situation with a hospital being bombed in the Gaza Strip. Never more do we need GCED. Never more do we need a conference like this, with these concrete examples facing us. But as I always tell my pre-service teachers, although you might start your sessions with a dose of reality, with a bit of shock and awe, as we call it, we need to very quickly pivot to the positive, not only just for educational purposes, but for our own well-being and mental health. And so we're going to pivot to the positive, and what can we do? What is our way forward? And that's our topics for our speakers today, is to give you two perspectives on those ways forward. I'd like to introduce our first speaker, who is Professor Patrick Dolan from University of Galway in Ireland. Professor Dolan was the first UNESCO chair awarded in Ireland, and he holds the chair for Children, Youth and Civic Engagement. He conducts programs of work within and supported by UNESCO Child and Family Research Centre that spans a range of global partnerships involving universities, NGOs, international agencies and youth organisations, encompassing research, education and policy development. Professor Dolan has worked with and for families as a practitioner, service manager and academic for over 35 years. He has completed an extensive body of research on family issues, including a longitudinal research study of adolescents, their perceived mental health, resilience and social support networks. And we know that word resilience has come up already a lot in our introductory comments. His major research is civic engagement in children and youth, family support, reflective practice and service development, youth mentoring models, empathy education, which he's particularly going to look at today, prevention of youth radicalisation, adolescent resilience, and social networks. I ask you to join me in welcoming Professor Dolan.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everybody. First of all, a big thank you to APSU, to the family of UNESCO, to the people here in Korea for the honor of speaking today. It's truly a pleasure to be with you. What I'm going to look at over the next kind of 15 minutes is to really explore and give a case. I'm making the case for empathy education as I believe, a critical way forward for global citizenship education in its own right. That's not to say that empathy is not a component of well-being education and some of the frameworks that are there for GCED. I'm just making a real case for empathy education and in particular through the voices of young people themselves. So I suppose to start, a key question is, what is empathy? Now, we could get into what is empathy, and that would be a conversation that would last a long time. But empathy is not sympathy. It's about compassion. It's often referred to as the capacity to step in the shoes of somebody else and understand where they're coming from. But overall, it's this capacity to identify with and understand another person's situations, their feelings and their motives. And in a way, understanding the attribution of your own feelings to the other. That's much easier for us with people that are near us and like us, similar to us. It's somewhat more of a challenge when it's further away, and I'm going to come back to that. Empathy is often described as either cognitive or affective. Cognitive is the capacity to think about and understand where the other is coming from. Affective is about emotionally engaging with it. And that's where moving in the moccasins really kicks in. I have to acknowledge the work of an incredible team of colleagues in Ireland and at Penn State University with whom I've worked very closely over the last 10 years, and in particular Dr. Charlotte Silk and Dr. Bernard Brady, and Professor Mark Brennan, who's fellow UNESCO chair at Penn State. Basically, these 4 points, which took us a long time to get to them, they're based on a systematic literature review of empathy and compassion in youth, a randomized controlled trial study of a program that we developed in schools, particularly for second-level schools, that really makes the case for a 4-component curriculum for empathy education. The first component is understanding empathy. The second one then is practicing it. And the third one, which can be a challenge, is about looking at the barriers to being empathic towards the other. And you can think even in our world today of how that can be an issue for some people, if not many people. The fourth part is about putting empathy into action. So we have developed this as a secondary school program in Ireland. I'm delighted to say that thanks to the Ministry of the Education in Ireland, it is now compulsory education in Ireland as of September of this year. So every pupil in a secondary school in Ireland is engaging in empathy education. A core part of designing the program was that the education is actually peer-led. Young people educate each other with the support of the teacher around putting empathy into practice. You might ask, how is empathy education so important to something like climate challenge or violence prevention? Well, working from the work of Kate Berardi, it's these 3 things. It's innate, it's something that we're naturally almost born with. So you could argue that even in the animal kingdom, you can see the way animals can demonstrate empathy. Sometimes even in classic videos where a child falls in a zoo and the animal does not actually attack the child. It might guide the child or protect the child. So it's there for us to begin with. Importantly, from an education point of view, and importantly from the point of view of GCED, we can cultivate it. One of the great pieces of news we have from neuroscience is that during the adolescent years particularly, the brain is growing, and one of the things that we now know that can be developed through plasticity in the brain is the capacity for greater empathy through education. And the last one really is about feeling it and creating it and thinking of all the pathways that young people in their community and within their families and in society can contribute to that. So this gets you to active empathy. In that context, You can see the way understanding that if you're living in one part of the world, climate challenge may not be an issue for you, but by being empathic towards other people for whom it's more urgent, you can coalesce with the other. You can see the other in a way that leads you to compassion, to joint action. Similarly, in terms of violence prevention, there's overwhelming evidence that where empathy can be developed in schools, within teacher education and within school culture and among peer groups, you get less hate speech, you get less labeling of the other, you get less violence towards others. So the evidence is overwhelmingly there that empathy has a key role to play here. I just want to I'm not going to go into the theory of intersectionality in with due respect to Kimberly Crenshaw. It would be impossible to summarize it even. But what I would say is that I do think that the notion of action education, education which is active in the community, active in the school, that is demonstrable, is key for empathy education. And there are the components that I laid out earlier we see as the recipe towards enabling that to happen. But just as we are individuals from different countries, we are not defined by just where we're from. We're also defined by things like our gender, our social class, issues that we may have in our life. So understanding that empathy is a very fluid thing. It's not defined simply by one characteristic. It is, as Kimberly Crenshaw calls it, the train station, that there's a mutual train station point in our lives, is a key way of understanding at a point in time what is the key issue for us in our life, what is our capacity to have empathy rather than empathy fatigue, is key to part of the education. Interestingly, Anne Maston's work in particular has looked at how empathy education can enable greater resilience or resiliency. And using the 5 R's, it's through being responsive, having a relationship of worth, reciprocity, which is about the give and take of understanding the other, and surprisingly for young people, the importance of ritual and routine in your life. This is what she describes as the ordinary magic of enabling resilience. And resilience is not just coping, it is the ability to overcome adversity, bounce back and do better than expected. So I think, putting it bluntly, empathy education holds the promise of the secret sauce to enable resiliency for young people and for communities. And with that in mind, myself and my colleague in UNESCO, Mark Benham, would make a very strong argument that if you look at social capital, and particularly human social capital, citizenship, education, and connecting with community, family and society are the key ingredients to empathy education. So empathy education is something that can occur in schools and non-formal settings, but it actually is something that comes in to the real world by how we connect not just with who is near, but also with who is far away. In other words, a different way of seeing the other. What are the benefits we get from empathy education? Well, the evidence shows that you get mastery, better capacity and confidence and ability. We know that particularly from neuroscience. You get better sense of belonging. And that's really interesting because you can have negative belonging and positive belonging. We would argue empathy education, by connecting globally with other young people or with other societies or the plight of others, creates a new form of belonging. That really is what we aspire to, and it's what GCED aspires to at its very core. And the 2 fruits that you get from that, the 2 fruits that it bears, are greater independence, independence of critical thinking, independence of thought, independence of better understanding, and at a very basic level, better compassion or better generosity. So we need to think really about the Bronfenbrenner model of the ecological approach to empathy. And that really applies in the context of a global understanding. So you can get empathic coping, which primarily may come from family or friends who are supportive and caring. That's the core to social support. But you also get it from community. And within community, I mean a wider understanding of community, one that reciprocally, positively connects with its members. At the moment, I'm engaged in a study with the Ukraine youth in 7 countries who have had to migrate to 7 countries. And a core issue that we're finding from the research we're doing at the moment, and I was in Poland 2 weeks ago working on this, a core issue that came up from young people was a sense of engagement in community. That was the key kind of, the key factor for them. And the way we're doing that study is that we're training young people to be youth as researchers. That's not young people as the subject of research, but as the creators of research. And we've a whole online training program, one that we used with UNESCO, with SHS, for the global study during COVID, which I think was a great success with 106 countries. So what I'm arguing, and my real important point in this, is that we need to give empathy education its proper value. It needs to be seen as important as learning maths in school. Because in the end of the day, we are humans with human relationships. It's what we all thrive off. When we wake up in the morning and when we go to bed at night, it's human interaction that is the key fluid to our daily lives. And really, when we think about peace building, it's an act of humanity. And when we think about the climate and what we need to do to respect our climate, it's a human activity. For me, empathy is the oil that oils the engine. And the engine I would really strongly advocate for is the engine of social support in a global sense, and which bears the fruit of resilience or capacity to do well. So what does the evidence tell us around empathy education? Well, there are 4 key benefits. The first one is that it opens up the new other relationship, not seeing the other as the enemy, not seeing the other as not important to us, not seeing the other as somebody who does not matter, but seeing the other as somebody who matters. And it should be noted that in seeing the other as somebody who matters, we actually benefit ourselves. There's a whole range of evidence that shows, for example, young people who are civically engaged, the benefit they get from volunteering is only exceeds what they do by what they benefit themselves. We get reciprocity of support, which is the common goal of climate justice, is about reciprocity of support. You get a reduction in personal bias and hatred, and an increase in self and external esteem. So that really gives you a civic response to less violence. And also you get respite from focusing on your own difficulty. You get better perspective taking. These are all proven benefits of empathy education. So just to prove that I haven't come up here to fool you, as Leonard Cohen said in one of his famous songs, there is a body of research and evidence, and these are 3 sample papers. And please feel free to visit our website, where there are a range of educative tools, resources available. And these have been shared obviously within the UNESCO community, but within our University UNESCO Chairs Global Network as well. Had I more time, I would be giving 4 minutes to people who are far more younger and far more important than I here. It would have been a YouTube video where young people took the telephone book of the research, and with actor Cillian Murphy, who's our patron, who I hope gets his Oscar for Oppenheimer, they created a YouTube video which looks at what is empathy based on the results of our finding. And I strongly recommend, rather than looking at me, which is okay too, that you think about looking at the video. And in the immortal words of Michelangelo, when he finished the Sistine Chapel eventually, he did say, "I am still learning." Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Dolan, and certainly take the moment to connect with Professor Dolan and perhaps get that YouTube clip so that you can have a look at it afterwards. Our next speaker, Professor Lee, is going to be speaking in Korean. So for those of you who are English speakers, you may wish to grab your translators. Channel 2 is the channel that you're looking for. So Professor Lee graduated from Ohio State University, and he's been a professor of environmental education at Jeonju National University since 2001. Until 2021, he was director of the National Centre for Environmental Education, and for the past 4 years, he's been the vice chair of the UNESCO ESD Korea Committee. For the past 20 years, he has also been conducting research and practice on environmental, sustainable development, and ecological transition education, both in and out of school. Recently, he's been working on developing educational education standards to foster global ecological citizens as a new humanity in the era of global climate crisis. I'm a bit envious here. He says he has moved to a small seaside town on the western part of the Korean peninsula, so I think we should have the next conference there. That sounds like a perfect place, which has given him the opportunity to engage in sustainable community building activities and researching event-centred environmental education methodologies that connect communities to the earth and nature to culture. Please join me in welcoming Professor Lee.
Good afternoon, everyone from all over the earth. I'm very happy to be here and very honorable to make a presentation. I'm going to talk about the meaning of becoming global eco-citizens in climate crisis. Before talking about these issues, I believe the biocultural diversity of the earth is critical to the sustainability of our communities, including language diversity. I believe the loss of language diversity is most significantly threatened by the rise of sea levels now. So there are many small islands that could be sunken by the rise of sea level. And maybe the people in the small island will have to move some other places, and then they are going to lose the chance to keep their mother languages. So I'm going to speak in Korean from now. (1985) Can I see my presentation materials? Oh, okay. Okay. 1985, Hannah Arendt wrote a book. Oh, I can speak English. Okay. 한나 아렌트는 인간의 조건이라는 책을
In 1985, Hannah Arendt wrote the book A Human Condition, and a year before that, the Soviet Union launched the first man-made satellite, the Sputnik, into space. As she wrote, it was a very significant event that showed that humans are becoming separated from the Earth, and she used Earth alienation in her book as a concept to describe the situation. We want to think about critical thinking as a thinking or a method to think about all the possibilities. If you look at the possibilities of human conditions, if you look at the condition of human possibilities, I believe that we need to rethink Earth. And I was reminded of Hannah Arendt's Human Condition. Of course, I'm sure you're familiar with planetary boundaries, and as you can see, the following 6 boundaries out of the 9 boundaries have reached a very dangerous limit. Here on this slide, you can see the city of Gwangju. This is where the university I work in is located. You can see that the flood inundated this town, and as you know, the climate crisis crisis affects not only Gwangju but also Canada, Pakistan, Libya, and also Australia in recent years. And many people and many lives have been destroyed or have been killed. So, how are we going to respond to this significant issue? I believe that this is a challenge of our times. If you look at the recent report by UNDP, the quality of life overall has begun to deteriorate. They say the Human Development Index has started to decline. Of course, COVID has had an impact on this graph, but if you look at the direction of this graph, if we are to follow the red path, this means that our lives and the future of Earth will be destroyed or will be under very grave threat. And we need to think about whether we can take this green line and where we are going to get the power to move this graph toward the green line in the future. I think this is the crux of the issue, and this is a question that we need to ask ourselves. Here on this graph, you can see that most developed countries, most OECD countries have an ecological footprint of 2 or 3. African countries have an ecological footprint less than 2, but their human development index is under 0.7. So if you look at the lower right part of the graph, so ecological footprint less than 1 and a human development index of more than 0.7 is the sustainable ecological civilization zone. However, as you can see, there are no countries, almost no countries, that are located within that zone. So a sustainable ecological civilization is still, it remains a utopia for humans. This is a result of a survey carried out recently. You can see that climate change has been cited as one of the most urgent problems that threaten the survival of humanity. The second is biodiversity. However, the results of the survey remain largely similar over the years, especially over the past 2-3 years. If you look at COVID-19, according to UNEP, it is closely related to ecological destruction, meat consumption, poaching. And so these are all cited as causes behind COVID. They are all environmental and ecological issues. But 6 months after COVID, 600 million people lost their jobs, which means this directly relates to poverty issues as well. And the population that lost most jobs were women in impoverished countries. So this also is connected to gender equality. When an impoverished woman loses her job, then she cannot care for her children, which leads to issues related to the rights of children. And these issues can be amplified in many parts of the world. They can be sources of conflict or they can aggravate existing conflicts. As you can see, all these disasters and multi-crises are interconnected, as you can see in this report. And this is what I'm trying to get at as well. Climate change is related to poverty and the economy, inequality, gender discrimination, peace. So climate change is interconnected with all these different issues. And in the backdrop, we have environmental and ecological destruction and degradation. In this sense, GCED and climate change education needs to emphasize that climate change is not simply an environmental problem. As Greta Thunberg has said, climate crisis is not just about environment, it's also about colonial, racist, patriarchal systems of oppression. In this sense, in this era of climate change, the goal of GCED should be to help people to deal with these issues in an integrated manner. They need to realize and be aware that environmental issues are related to economic issues, human rights issues. And so we need new models for education that can encompass this idea. Among the youth in Korea, some have requested for a constitutional petition at the constitutional court of the country. And the reason they did so was that they believe that their rights to the environment, to life, and to the pursuit of happiness have been violated by the president and the National Assembly through their inadequate response to climate change. They believe their basic rights have been violated. And the youth have raised this issue. And I think that this is a very important starting point in building an eco-civilization because it shows self-awareness. UNESCO published a very important report recently, a new social contract for education. If you look at the report, it emphasizes that we need to see the environment as a shared resource. And education should be considered as commons. If you look at Korea, there is a lot of commitment to education, and a lot of education is privatized. So we need to really consider hard as a country what it means for education as commons and what it means for education to become a public asset. Digital technology and science technology have heightened insecurity, and there have been concerns about this. So unsustainability and uncertainty is rampant. In order to deal with how can we change education, that is also a very important central question. I have been carrying out research to develop new environmental education standards. And I've been doing this for the past 3 years with the support of the Korean government. And we are not trying to come up with counter standards or alternative standards. We are not trying to come up with something rigid. Students and teachers should become aware of what they want to study and learn, and they need to make a decision on their own. And teachers and students use this reference as a new standard to do so. And the new humanity that this new standard pursues is global eco-citizens. So what are global eco-citizens? Global eco-citizens are global citizens. They're ecologically aware citizens, and they're also democratic citizens. So they know how to live with other people. They know how to live with other beings on Earth. They know how to learn with Earth and the planet. And global eco-citizens have the willingness and competency to do this. And what are the key competency that is required by global eco-citizens? I would have to say it is transformative environmental competency. The title of our conference today uses the word transformative. And the UNESCO slogan also used transforming our world. So transforming something is very important. So we need to think about what it really means. It means, put simply, that if we continue down our path, the planet will no longer be sustainable. So we need to build new competencies, and we need standards to be able to foster new competencies. And one of the key competencies is critical thinking. In the process of developing these standards, I carried out a survey once. I carried out a survey for about 1,500 students and citizens. I asked them who they thought they are. And they had to pick two that best represented their identity. And I gave them 6 options. I am me. I am part of my family. I am a village or a regional person. I am Korean. I am Asian, or I am an earthly. And you can see that most respondents said that I am Korean and I am me best represents their identity. And I think that if you put these two together, they represent your typical modern human being. If you look at modern times, reason is highly valued. And based on reason, you are to live your life independently. And that was important in modern times. And with the birth of the independent state, regardless of your willingness, when you are born, you belong to a country. So you are born into a system. So when you ask people who they are, they always associate themselves with themselves and then with their country, usually. But I think through GCED or global eco-citizen education, I think that people will be able to identify themselves with a certain region or a certain village or as an earthling. So they will no longer see themselves as an isolated being. In fact, their horizon will be broadened to see themselves as part of a bigger community. And I think that this will contribute in creating a new vision. So the meaning of becoming global eco-citizens or earthlings, this is about building a new global community. In Korea, it would have to do with building a new constitution. And when these collective efforts come together, we will be able to build a different world. So I hope that when somebody asks you who you are, one day we will be able to answer that we are an earthling. So everything that happens on the earth is related to me and it matters to me. And I think that this is our future direction forward. This is the goal that we should have in terms of GCED education.
Thank you very much, Professor Lee. Just reminding you, there's some wonderful points raised in both of those presentations. So if it's raised any questions or comments for you, if you would just like to jot them on a piece of paper, there's staff circulating around that would be happy to pick up a piece of paper and bring it out so we can pose some questions to our panellists. In the meantime, I'm going to take a moderator's privilege because I have a couple of questions of my own. And I wanted to start with you, Mr. Lee, because I know teachers that I talk to, sometimes particularly in the field of climate crisis, climate education, are concerned that they will, if you like, step on the toes of the values of the family, or that they will be upsetting the children, that there will be mental health issues that will need to be addressed by the family because you're making my child anxious. In your research, how do you find that balance of being positive and still addressing those issues?
Oh, thank you very much. 저는 기후 변화가 우리 마음속에
I believe that climate change creates two valleys, two emotional valleys within us. The first
불안감,
creates anxiety,
우울감,
depression,
anxiety and depression, 그리고 그게 흘러서
and that flows into rage and guilt,
anger and guilty. 그리고는 그게 시간이 지나면
and over time
하려고 하나 소용없다는 걸 발견하게
it
느껴지는
flows and becomes helplessness.
그리고 그게 더 심해지면
And if that gets worse,
인간이란 원래 저래. 인간에
it turns into distrust in human beings. And if that goes further, people will give up and become disinterested. I think that there is a possibility of such a valley being created. So in order for us to respond to this issue and not create that valley, we need to listen to others. We need to continue to study. As Professor Dolan mentioned earlier, I think empathy is also very important in stopping us from creating that value within us. We need a more connected self. We need to expand ourselves, and we need to make ourselves more ecological. So we need to think about this when we carry out climate change education and also in GCED education overall.
Thank you very much. I think there are a couple of questions coming forward, but I will just ask one more of Professor Dolan, if I may. I'm sure it's the same in Ireland. We certainly have issues with teacher burnout post-COVID, and many education departments are just going, well, I'm not implementing any more projects, any more programs. How did you manage that, getting the agreement, the understanding around empathy education, that it wasn't just one more thing that we've got to deal with and we've got to incorporate?
Yeah, well, it really was a four-factor approach, and very, it didn't just happen by accident. The first thing we did was that we really worked on what is the evidence that we can provide to teachers that empathy education is crucial. Because what we were finding on things like personal health education, teachers in secondary schools were saying, we're so busy, we're going to do a maths class instead. They didn't even prioritize it, around civic education. So what we did, first of all, was really look at the evidence for empathy education. And what we found was that actually, if you teach empathy education, you do better in your grades. The evidence is there that if you do, regardless of, even if you don't believe in empathy education, if you want your students to get better grades, do empathy education. The second thing we did was that we worked really closely on developing what is summarized on one slide, which was 4 years work on developing a 12-class, 40-minute curriculum that covered all the aspects of empathy education. And even went into things like, what's the difference between well-being and education? I can think of very famous people in the world who are well known for having nothing wrong with their well-being, but they've absolutely no empathy for other people. So, even getting that into getting a better understanding was the second component based on the evidence. And the third thing then was the participation of young people and teachers themselves. We worked with teacher education groups and with young people on designing the curriculum in a way that it was fun, interesting, and really meaningful. And then, quite frankly, the last one was we went on an advocacy campaign, not just with the Minister for Education and senior public civil servants, but also with the public. And that's where the actor Cillian Murphy played a huge role. And within 9 months, we had it agreed. And we've still lots more to do in it, but it was very much a concerted effort. And I have to say, in fairness to an acknowledgement to colleagues in UNESCO, both in Fontenoy, in Paris and elsewhere, we're now looking at, well, can this be included in GCED? Can this be considered as something that can be used in other countries? And there's a lot of interest in it, which is great. But having said that, we don't have it's about really joined up thinking. And this is just one component in global citizen education. It's not the panacea.
Yeah. And I think that's the important part to remember in a lot of our conversations around this, that these are all components of this big picture of the type of education that we're trying to provide. There's an interesting question that's been raised here that for you, Professor Lee, that you did not include I am me in your future diagram. And I think the question is being posed, how can we have a sense of community without having that sense of self-awareness within that community?
질문 감사합니다.
Thank you very much for your question.
제가 나는 나를 미래의
I had,
정책적인 부분에서 배제한 것은 아니고요.
it wasn't that I disincluded I am me from the future diagram.
개체화된 자아로서의 나는 나.
I wanted to say that the independent, isolated me should become a little smaller. And the awareness that I'm part of a village, I'm part of a community, and when enlarged, I am part of the global community, is where we should be heading. So in a more enlarged sense of self, we have to become aware of ourselves as independent beings. I do believe that the independent me, and I am earthling can coexist. So I can be me, and I can be part of a village. And these two can coexist. And in fact, they should. impact each other in a good, positive way. And this can help enrich our lives and enhance the quality of life. So, I am me is not excluded from the identity of the global eco-citizens, more like it has to be balanced with the overall global eco-citizen.
Thank you. And I think before I move on to the next question, I'd like to include you in that conversation too, Professor Dolan, is in this role of empathy, which is, considering others, where is self in that? Where is self-awareness and self-understanding in empathy education?
Yeah, so one of the components we have in it is looking at self-compassion. Now that is different to narcissism, so we have to make that very clear. But the work of Kister and Neff around basically giving yourself a break at certain times at a very human level. So self-empathy, self-compassion, and looking out for, which is a big issue we found for young people in the research of empathy fatigue. Because even there are things like young people who are carers in their families, and for whom them going to school is a burden rather than a blessing. So even contextualizing empathy education, it's not just within what happens when you walk into the school. That 10 minutes before you come into school, or the 10 minutes after school, can be crucial. And as Professor Lee has said, it really is about a more critical understanding. I mean, if you look at the SDGs, I mean, SDG 1, 3, and particularly for SDG 4, 4.7.1 about quality education, and particularly for marginalised populations, I think it really is a key connector.
Absolutely. And I think a key connector between what we're talking about today, because you can obviously engage with other issues, other people, hastening to use that term, if you have that strong sense of who you are in that role. We've got the question of technology, which is a compulsory part of every youth's lives these days. But there are concerns that the use of technology, particularly during COVID, has made youth feel alone, lonely. So how can you incorporate that into strategies of empathy education?
Yeah, and it's a really good point, and I think a lot of research on the impact of COVID, and particularly the global study that we did in collaboration with UNESCO, brought this up continuously. So, I mean, empathy is this capacity to mirror with the other, and sometimes to mirror with the other that can be very different to you, and that is the challenge. That's the objective, is to be able to do that. One of the things we found is that, or some of the evidence is, and it's coming from young people themselves rather than anybody else, is that once you have a context to empathize. So, for example, what young people were saying that they really liked about looking at empathy education, not just specifically our program, which is a program, what they specifically liked is that it is a positive. It is something I can do. Very often, one of the challenges around, and there are brilliant anti-bullying programs, absolutely. It's not a criticism of anti-bullying programs. But one of the problems is that it's trying to deal with a deficit model. That what you're trying to do is essentially repair at a human level. The great thing about empathy is that you put it into your own agency, and you take that agency, and that's a key message on the curriculum. And that gets into back to self-empathy. Yeah. But again, just to reiterate the caveat, it's not about self-loving and then other-loathing, which is a danger.
Yes, absolutely. I like to include both perspectives into the conversation. So I know, as somebody who watched the school strike for climate in Australia, the role of social media in gathering support for those enormous marches we had through the street was seen as a positive of social media, but then the haters came on board as well. How do you see the role of technology in schools or outside schools in climate change education? Professor Lee?
In the past 3-4 years, During the COVID pandemic, students could not go to school, and a lot of things happened during those 3 to 4 years. Parents who both work, parents who are not well off, the children in these families, they have computers in Korea because, as you know, Korea has one of the best developed internets in the world. So they had all the hardware, but very young children in first or second grade, without parental or adult supervision or guidance, would just become lost in the internet and lost in digital education. And so many teachers are now concerned that during COVID, many children have trouble reading and writing. And the proportion of such children have increased, and they are considered that this will lead to an educational divide that can lead to an economic divide. And if you look at Korea, it actually has a lot of islands, and the schools in these islands are very small, and the student population is small, so it's very difficult for them to come up with diverse programs. Through COVID, however, the teachers of the schools, they came together and they collaborated and they invited famous writers or authors and offered programs online. They used the technology and they realized better education for their students. And so if you look at the experience of the past 3 to 4 years, we need to think about how far we can expand this network. How far are we willing to go back to pre-COVID times? And one of my concerns recently is that in Korean schools, many teachers use YouTube in the classroom. And there is a divide between what the children can actually do and what they believe they can do. For instance, if you look at YouTube, they build an entire building in just 15 minutes. But these kids, they don't even know how to use a hammer. And so experience through media and experience through internet actually leads to an experiential divide. And there's a disconnect between what children believe they can do and what they can actually do. And I think that this is a very important concern. And this is something that must be addressed when we are developing programs in the future.
Thank you, Professor Lee. There's a couple of interesting questions that have arisen here for you, Professor Dolan, and I'm going to pop them together in the interest of time. One is looking at what is the difference between practicing empathy and putting empathy into practice. The second question is the theoretical frame of empathy education is the questioner says relatively straightforward, but can you give some examples, some pedagogical examples as to how do we actually go about it?
Yeah, sure. So in terms of the first question, which is in relation to putting empathy into practice and practice, so I mean the way we've developed the module, and in a way it relates to the last question, for example, that for even abuse of young people online, that there's quite a movement around empathy education where young people counteract that, and we don't give enough recognition to that. I mean, there are huge issues around platforms and social responsibility. That's another question, which is a wider question, which I think is going to come more to the fore. The practice element of it is that you think about yourself to begin with, and you mirror with one other person, and you actually listen because you've 2 ears and 1 mouth in that order. You learn to use it a little bit. And then you, with that other person, then you think about situations in your life where empathy has occurred in a good way or maybe not in a good way, and you develop it from there. So it's very much an experiential process, which leads into the second part of the question. So we have guidance for teachers on the program, And I should say the program is also being used in non-formal education among community youth work organisations with gusto at the moment in various locations around the globe. A practical example would be a teacher would reflect on something in their own life growing up, and then would ask the pupils to talk about what was their experience of that. And there's rules around, of course, if a young person becomes distressed, or we have an ethical guide that goes with the program. But what you do is you just start conversations. It's about connections. It's about, that's what empathy is. It's about human connection and interaction and integration. It's those three components that are core to the program. Another way we do it is that we ask young people to think about something they know absolutely nothing about. And we've got a great example in the research where young people were very interested in Rohingya youth and what was the issues for Rohingya youth in Myanmar and Bangladesh. And that was within an English, a context of an English cohort. And they openly said they didn't know where these countries were. So it began a conversation, and they learned where Burma was. It began, and then it became a conversation about Rohingya youth and their desire to just retain their education, and about how that became an empathy. So the teacher led a geography class into an empathy class. We've even had teachers maths teachers who've used empathy, which is really, and music, as you can imagine. It's very obvious if you're reading a Charles Dickens book and you get into The Plight of David Copperfield, how that's all about empathy. So there are different ways that this can happen.
Absolutely. One of my favourite things is to show maths teachers that you can put GCED in maths, because they always tell me you can't do it. So when we're producing units of work, we actually produce 2 in maths just to make a point.
김한 교수님 말씀에 하나만 덧붙여도 괜찮을까요?
Would I be able to add to?
We have a couple of minutes.
Okay, 1 minute.
30 seconds. Yeah.
저는 환경교육을 하면서
In providing environmental education, I was frequently told in the past 30 years, we know that climate change is a grave issue. Why do people not take action? I think that this is because people don't know the difference between understanding the issue and empathizing with people in need. People are dying, and we are seeing species become distinct. I think if you have empathy, that leads to actual action. So understanding the problem and having empathy is entirely different. And in order to take action, you need to be able to empathize.
Absolutely. And I think that's a perfect point to wrap up our session on, because to me, that understanding of the plight, understanding the situation, having empathy for the situation is what leads to the action. We can cognitively understand it, but until we have the empathy, the values and attitudes, we're not going to take action. I'm sure you'll agree, our 2 speakers have, as is wont for a plenary opening session, raised so many more questions for us, which is a really positive way to start our conference. So please join me in thanking Professor Dolan and Professor Lee for their wonderful contribution.